She thought they were mocking her. The dust clung to her bare ankles. Her uniform was torn. Her hands, cuffed in front of her, trembled, not from fear, but exhaustion. The train had left them at a forgotten siding somewhere in the Texas plains, and now she stood blinking in the sunlight as a group of Americans in wide-brimmed hats approached on horseback. Her knees buckled. She braced for laughter, for cruelty, for the pointed finger of vengeance. Instead, the tallest one, boots caked in red clay, spat into the dirt and said, "She ain't a prisoner to me." The others nodded. One dismounted, tipped his hat, and offered her a hand. She froze, stunned. No one moved to beat her. No one shouted orders. A horse whinnied nearby. A breeze stirred her hair, and that was how her captivity began, not with a cage, but with gentleness. She had been told the Americans were monsters. She had never been warned about kindness. The wheels of the transport truck ground to a halt, kicking up a cloud of rust-colored dust that clung to everything: skin, hair, memory. The women inside blinked through the haze, their eyes bloodshot from days of travel. Their uniforms, once pressed and proper, now hung in tatters. Some had used strips of cloth to bind their feet where their boots had split open. Others clutched canvas satchels like lifelines, though most contained little more than combs, tin spoons, or folded photographs. The sun above was brutal. The air shimmered with heat. But what stopped them cold wasn't the temperature, it was the men waiting at the gate. Wide-brimmed hats, denim shirts, worn boots, rifles slung low like afterthoughts. Cowboys. The word didn't quite register. One woman whispered it in Japanese, as if naming a creature from legend. They had expected soldiers, harsh voices, snarling dogs, and boots that kicked instead of walked. But here stood a group of Americans who looked more like ranchers than military police. One leaned on the fence, chewing a blade of grass, his posture relaxed but alert. Another adjusted the brim of his hat and watched the women with an expression that wasn't cruelty, but wasn't exactly welcome either. It was something else. Caution, maybe, or curiosity. No one shouted, no one sneered. And then, from the edge of the group, a voice drawled out loud enough for all to hear, "She ain't a prisoner to me." That sentence hung in the air like smoke. Some of the women flinched, waiting for the punchline or the punishment. But nothing came. Instead, the men stepped back and gestured toward the entrance of the camp with the kind of silence that unnerved more than screams ever could. As the women stepped down from the truck, one staggered and nearly fell. A cowboy caught her elbow to steady her. She yanked her arm away instinctively, teeth bared. He didn't react, just nodded once and stepped back. Inside the camp was more confusion. Rows of low barracks stood beneath the blistering sky, wooden and plain but neatly built. No towers, no searchlights. The fences had barbed wire, yes, but the gates stood open as the new arrivals were ushered through. A horse neighed in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a radio played slow country music, twanging and strange. It didn't feel like a prison. It felt like something worse, a stage set for a game they didn't understand. Was this real? Or was the cruelty just hidden behind the warmth, waiting? They were led to the mess hall first. The heat inside was thicker, filled with the smell of grease and coffee. An older man, bearded with sun-dark skin, stood behind the counter, ladling something onto trays: eggs, biscuits, beans. The women hesitated. One stepped forward, took a tray, and stared at it like it was made of glass. The cowboy behind the counter gave her a nod. "Eat or don't. Up to you." She blinked at him, uncertain whether the words were a trick. Outside, the camp, unfolded like a riddle. There were work areas, gardens, even a paddock with horses, A few guards leaned against fence posts, chatting low and lazy in the heat. No barking orders, no threats. One woman murmured, "This is a trap." Another whispered, "No, it's theater. They're performing something for us." That night, lying in bunks that didn't smell of mold or blood, the confusion only deepened. Some women didn't sleep at all. They lay staring at the ceiling, ears straining for the sound of boots, the scream in the dark, the pain they'd been promised. But it didn't come. Only the low hum of cicadas and the steady breath of strangers beginning to feel dangerously safe. She had been warned. They all had. From the first days of training, when stiff uniforms still carried the starch of ceremony and not the weight of blood, they were told that capture was a fate worse than death. Surrender was not only weakness, it was treason, a stain on the soul that could never be cleansed. Bushido, the code of honor once worn like armor by the samurai, had trickled down into the military clinics and telegraph stations where these women were assigned. Even the nurses, even the clerks. They repeated the words like a prayer, "Better to die than be taken." And now, here they were, alive, taken, and nothing felt like what they had been promised. One woman, Masako, remembered how her commanding officer in Yokohama had paced in front of their training barracks, his voice rising like thunder. "The Americans are beasts. They will shame you, starve you, violate you. If you are ever captured, take your own life." She had nodded with the others, straight-backed and wide-eyed. She had even sewn a small blade into her belt hem, just in case. That blade now lay at the bottom of a confiscated satchel, untouched. No opportunity, no moment of cinematic finality, just arrival, dust, cowboys. And now, a blanket. The blanket was folded at the foot of her bunk when she awoke that morning. Clean, rough, but whole. She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether it was meant for her. The idea that she deserved such a thing was foreign. Her bed in the final days of the war had been a patch of concrete behind a field hospital shared with rodents. That blanket had been a sack of rice, long since emptied. Now here she was, with a roof, a bed, and what smelled, absurdly, like fresh coffee drifting from the mess hall. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, sat in silence, and wept. The others were no different. Some clung tightly to their discipline, folding clothes with mechanical precision, eyes never rising above the floor. Others drifted like ghosts, confused, hollow, waiting for the scream, the blow, the punishment that would confirm they were still in a war. But it never came. Instead, a guard knocked lightly at the barracks door and offered a tray of toast and eggs. "Breakfast," he said with an accent thick and slow. One of the women stared at him and whispered, "Why?" There was no answer. Afterward, they were led outside. A corporal in a tan shirt, sleeves rolled high against the heat, offered them shade beneath a tree. He spoke a few words in Japanese, badly, then handed out pencils, paper. "If you want to write," he said, "home." Some of the women laughed, sharp and bitter. Others cried again. The contradiction was unbearable. These were not the men they had been warned about. These were not the monsters carved in propaganda leaflets, gnashing teeth and cruel eyes. These were just men. And that, perhaps, was worse. Because if they were not monsters, then who had lied? If capture was not dishonor, then what had? All the sacrifice meant? The letters written that day were strange and short. "I am alive. I have a bed. They treat us like people." That last sentence felt dangerous, even as it passed from pencil to paper, like betrayal, but of whom? Masako folded her letter with trembling hands. She looked at the trees beyond the fence, at the cowboy lighting a cigarette by the shed, and felt the weight of the code she had been taught. Not a code of survival, but of silence. And it was that silence now that felt most like prison. The first night had been the most disorienting, not because of fear, but because of its absence. The barracks were simple: wooden beams, thin mattresses, pale gray blankets folded into precise rectangles. No shackles, no shouted orders, no barked threats in broken Japanese. Just the unfamiliar rustle of cotton sheets and the heavy quiet of a place not at war. The silence pressed down like weight, not dangerous, but intimate. It left them alone with themselves in a way the battlefield never had. Masako had lain awake, the ceiling above her blurring in the dark. She could hear the slow breathing of the other women around her, punctuated by the occasional shift of a mattress or the creak of a bed frame. Someone cried softly in the corner. Someone else hummed a lullaby under her breath. Masako clutched the blanket to her chest and waited for the crack of a rifle or the sting of humiliation. But the only thing that came was morning light. When the door opened at dawn, the guard didn't yell. He knocked first, then pushed the door open with his hat in one hand. "Roll call," he said. "Let's get you counted." But then he did something no one expected. He looked down at the clipboard in his hand and read out a name, not a number, not a rank, a name. Sugihara. Masako? It landed like thunder. She stiffened. No one had spoken her name in weeks, not since the transport ships, not since the march. Names had been peeled away layer by layer until only roles remained: nurse, clerk, prisoner. To hear it again, spoken by an American voice, thick and foreign, was like having a mirror held up to a forgotten self. She stepped forward, blinking. "Here," she whispered. He looked up, nodded, and scratched something onto the page. This became routine. Each morning, names called, each woman stepping forward with hesitant voices. Some flinched at the sound. Others straightened, drawn by the sudden recognition. Names, spoken out loud, had power. They were not identification. They were restoration. In the days that followed, the transformations came slowly. One woman took to folding her blanket at night in the exact pattern she had learned from her mother back home, smoothing the edges with practiced hands. Another began to shine her shoes again, even though they would never leave the compound. A guard noticed this, and one day left a fresh rag on her bunk. No comment, just the gesture. Masako, for her part, was startled to find her name written on a small strip of cardboard above her bed. "Monsieur Sugihara," it read. Handwritten, carefully printed, tacked in place with a small thumbtack. She touched it as though it might disappear. No one had assigned her a number. No one had labeled her as enemy female, property of U.S. Army. Just her name, and a bed. It was nothing. It was everything. One afternoon, the guards distributed laundry bags. The clothes came back, washed, folded, and laid neatly at the foot of each bed. Masako opened hers and gasped softly. Her old undershirt, stitched once by her sister, had been mended. Not expertly, but earnestly. Someone had seen the tear and closed it with thread. She hadn't asked. She hadn't expected. Yet someone had cared enough to restore what had been broken. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual. Not because of fear, but because the women didn't know how to explain what they were feeling. The war had taught them obedience, endurance, silence. But now the guards were teaching them something far more unsettling, that their lives, their comfort, their names might matter after all. The following week, a sign-up sheet appeared near the mess hall. At the top, someone had scrawled in thick black letters, "Voluntary work detail." The word that caught every eye wasn't work, it was voluntary. Masako stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether it was a trick. Back home, in the final days of the war, labor was demanded, extracted from the body like water from stone. Here, it was being offered, not commanded. Some women turned away, suspicious. Others hovered, hesitating. And then, one by one, they signed their names. The work was varied. Garden plots in the back field, a sewing room near the edge of the barracks, and a few positions at the ranch that bordered the northern fence. That's where Masako found herself 2 days later, clutching a battered straw hat and wiping sweat from her brow beneath the unrelenting sun. She was given gloves and told she could stop any time she wished. She never quite believed that, not at first. But as the day stretched into noon, and the smell of horses mingled with the rustle of prairie grass, no one barked orders. The cowboy, overseeing the detail, even whistled as he worked, soft and tuneless. At lunch, he waved her over to the porch. The ranch house wasn't part of the camp exactly, but it stood close enough to feel like a myth come alive. Rocking chairs, wind chimes, and a pitcher of water sweating on a shaded table. She climbed the steps, slowly, half expecting it to vanish under her feet. He poured her a cup of black coffee without a word, handed it over, and sat down. She held the mug in both hands. It was hot, bitter, strong enough to jolt her back into herself. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said, in the slow drawl of a man who had never hurried for anything in his life, "You remind me of my sister. She stitched up a horse's leg once. Real steady hands. You got those." Masako blinked. Compliments were foreign, especially from an American, especially in a war. "You ever heard of Ecclesiastes?" he asked, as if continuing a conversation she hadn't known they'd started. She shook her head. He smiled and leaned back in his chair. "It says, 'To everything there is a season.' That always stuck with me, a time for war and a time for peace. You ever wonder what comes after surrender?" She didn't answer, not because she didn't want to, but because she hadn't allowed herself to wonder anything in months. He took a sip from his cup and looked out across the land as if the horizon might answer for her. "Some folks think kindness is weakness," he said, tapping his boot against the porch, "but it takes a stronger man to shake hands than to pull a trigger." Masako watched him, uncertain. Every part of her training told her this was manipulation, a ploy, a softening of the enemy before the blow, but his voice held no edge, only weariness. The coffee in her hands was cooling, the sun was tilting westward, and nothing about this moment felt rehearsed. Later that evening, as she returned to the barracks, she couldn't stop replaying his words, not the scripture, not even the part about his sister, but the question. What came after surrender? She lay in bed that night staring at the beams above her, and for the first time since capture, she felt something shift. Not relief, not trust, but curiosity, dangerous, delicate curiosity. She did not yet believe in their kindness, but she could no longer deny its presence. And that, more than anything, terrified her. The chapel was barely more than a wooden shed, tucked behind the mess hall, with a crooked white cross nailed above the door, and a small sign that read simply, "Chapel. All welcome." At first the women avoided it. Some thought it was a trap. Others assumed it was only for the guards. Masako noticed it one evening as she walked back from kitchen duty, the sun dropping low behind the fence, streaking the sky in a wash of gold and rust. The door was open. Light spilled out onto the dirt like something sacred, and for a moment she stood frozen. She stepped inside the next night. It smelled of old wood and candle wax. The pews were rough but clean. There were no icons, no statues, only a small lectern and a faded American flag pinned to one wall. But it was the piano that caught her breath, a battered upright tucked into the corner, keys chipped and yellowing, several of them missing altogether. Still, it sat like a secret waiting to be remembered. The first time she heard it played, she cried. A guard, young, freckles on his arms, hair slicked back with too much oil, sat down at the bench and began to play a hymn. The notes were hesitant, imperfect, but they filled the small room with something the war had stolen long ago. Softness. The melody rose like breath and settled over the prisoners seated along the walls. No one spoke, no one moved. When he finished, the silence was heavy with something unspoken, not grief, not even peace. Wonder. The next evening more women came. They sat quietly, hands in their laps, unsure if they were allowed to be there at all. But the guards made no protest. In fact, one of them, an older man with a thick accent and kind eyes, motioned for one of the women to come forward. She did. Her name was Yumi, and she had played as a girl before her family lost everything. Her fingers hovered above the keys like birds remembering how to fly. When she began, it wasn't a hymn, not exactly. It was something else, an old folk tune, Japanese in origin, but slowed down, smoothed into something tender. No one sang. They just listened. That night, Masako couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk, eyes open, heart racing, not from fear, but from memory. The sound of the piano had awakened something she thought was dead. Not patriotism, not faith in the emperor. Something older, quieter. The memory of her mother humming in the kitchen, her younger brother tapping rhythms on the table, a world where music wasn't about marching or ceremony or war, but about beauty, useless, tender, and completely human. In the days that followed, the chapel became a strange refuge. Women and guards alike came at dusk, sometimes only to sit in silence. A Bible was placed near the front, its pages worn, left open to psalms. No one preached, no one commanded. The doors were never locked. One evening a guard brought in a harmonica. Another prisoner, curious, asked if she could try. He nodded. She took it, blew a few tentative notes, then laughed, a small, startled sound. Laughter in a place meant for shame. Masako sat in the back row, fingers tracing the grain of the wood beneath her, and wondered how something so small, so quiet, could feel like rebellion. They had been taught that their value came from duty, that beauty without service was indulgence. But here, in a shed beside a barbed wire fence, they were offered music with no price, prayer with no punishment. It was the first place in the camp where she felt not like a prisoner, not like a soldier, but simply like a woman, alive and unbroken. And she realized with quiet clarity that something inside her was beginning to shift, not because someone commanded it, but because dignity, once offered, could not be ignored. The delousing room was nothing special, just a small tiled building behind the barracks with metal spigots, slotted drains, and rows of hooks on the walls. But for the women who stepped inside that morning, it might as well have been a cathedral. They came in small groups, wary and silent, unsure of what waited behind the heavy door. The last time they'd been marched into a bathing facility, it had not ended with comfort. So they braced for shame. They braced for humiliation. Instead, they were handed soap. Real soap, not powder, not lye, not the harsh industrial blocks that burned the skin and stripped the hands raw. This soap smelled of lavender and pine, and it came with clean towels, thick and folded. One guard, a middle-aged woman in uniform, offered a faint smile as she gestured them forward. "Take your time," she said, then turned away, giving them privacy. It was not just unexpected, it was unfathomable. Masako took a bar in her hands and stared at it as if it might vanish. She rolled it between her palms, feeling its weight, its smoothness. When she brought it to her nose and inhaled, something inside her buckled. She stepped into the shower stall, turned the handle, and flinched as warm water poured down. Not cold, not punishing, warm. The first few moments were mechanical. She scrubbed her arms, her legs, her neck. But then she touched her face and stopped. For the first time in years, she washed herself without rushing, without fear, without filth clinging stubbornly to her skin. The scent of the soap filled the small stall. The steam rose like a fog. And suddenly, she began to cry. Not in great sobs, but in slow, trembling gasps. The kind of crying that sneaks up on you when you realize you're no longer surviving. You're living. She wasn't the only one. Outside the showers, another woman stood before a mirror bolted to the wall. She wiped the fog away and stared. It took her a long moment to recognize the reflection. Her cheekbones, no longer caked with dust. Her lips, no longer cracked. Hair damp and clinging to her forehead like it had when she was a girl. She touched the glass as if to test whether it was truly her. Then she covered her mouth with one hand and wept quietly. That night, the letters they wrote home were unlike any they'd written before. Masako crouched over her bunk with a stub of pencil and a trembling hand. Her letter read, "Today I washed with warm water. They gave us soap that smelled like flowers. I looked in a mirror and saw someone I thought had died. I cannot explain this place. It feels like a dream, or worse, a trick. But the trick never comes." Others wrote similar words. One woman described the chapel, the piano, the soft bread served with supper. Another described the way the guards greeted them by name now, or how one cowboy left a flower on the windowsill each morning without saying a word. And one sentence appeared more than once. "It is a paradise I do not trust, but cannot deny." They hid those letters inside envelopes and handed them off to the guards, who promised, again, that they would be sent. Whether the letters reached home or not was almost beside the point. The writing itself became its own act of healing, a confession to the self, an attempt to name something impossible. For so long the women had been told what they were: enemies, tools, failures, shameful. But now, with every scrubbed hand and lavender-scented breath, a new story was beginning to write itself, one of salt and soap and survival that no longer felt like surrender. The morning began like any other. Réveillé at dawn, folded blankets, the clatter of trays at breakfast. But there was a tension in the air, a ripple of murmured rumors that passed from bunk to bunk like sparks. Something was happening. The guards were busy, but not with drills. They were setting up chairs, rows and rows of them, outside the wire, near the far edge of the compound, where the grass grew high and wild. One of the women saw a horse being led in, then another, then a truck pulling a makeshift pen. By noon, the truth was impossible to ignore. They were staging a rodeo, in a prisoner-of-war camp. The women stood behind the fence, their hands wrapped around the cold wire, and stared in stunned silence. It wasn't a joke. The cowboys were real, dressed in denim and dust, slapping each other's backs, adjusting saddles and tipping hats. Horses kicked up dust as they paced the perimeter. A wooden platform had been rigged for seating. On it, prisoners were told they could sit, freely, to watch the event. Masako blinked at the absurdity. Was it entertainment? A psychological trick? Some grotesque parody of American joy? They sat anyway. The sun was high, and the air smelled of leather and manure and something else. Popcorn. Someone had brought a kettle. Another handed out bottles of soda, sweating with condensation. Masako held hers as if it were a live grenade. She hadn't tasted carbonation in years. When she opened the cap, it fizzed over her fingers and landed on the skirt of her borrowed dress. She flinched, mortified, then froze as a voice beside her said, "Careful now, that stuff's trickier than a bull on Sunday." It was one of the younger guards, the freckled one with the harmonica. He grinned and offered her a handkerchief. For a moment she didn't move. Then, carefully, she took it and wiped the syrup from her skin. He nodded and sat on the bench beside her, tipping his hat back. The moment was surreal. She half expected someone to shout at him, to drag him away, to remind him that she was the enemy. But no one did. In the ring, a cowboy mounted a bronco. The horse reared back, wild and furious, and the man held on with one hand while the other flailed in the air. The women gasped. Then, as he was thrown off in a dramatic tumble, they laughed. Not mockery, genuine laughter. Something cracked open. Masako turned to the guard beside her. "Why do you do this?" she asked in halting English. He shrugged. "War don't last forever." She didn't know how to answer that. She wasn't sure she believed it, but he handed her another bottle, this time unopened, and said, "You don't gotta drink it, but you should know it's cold." She took it. Nearby, another woman, Yumi, the piano player, was laughing so hard at a calf chase gone wrong that she clutched her sides. A cowboy had fallen face first into a pile of dirt, and even the other Americans were howling. One of the older women whispered, "This must be a dream." Another replied, "Then let's not wake up." For a few hours the lines blurred. Guards and prisoners became audience and participants. The sun sank lower, and the laughter came easier. Even the fences, which had once felt like iron walls, seemed less absolute. Masako sipped the soda. It was too sweet, too sharp, but real. She looked around and realized that fear had been replaced, just for a moment, by something unthinkable. Joy. And it terrified her more than anything she'd known in war. The pencil felt foreign in her hand. Not because she had forgotten how to write, but because the words waiting to be written had never been allowed before. Masako sat at a wooden desk near the barracks window, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the page. A guard had handed her the letter form earlier that day. "You can write home," he said simply. "Keep it honest. We'll send it." She didn't believe him at first, but she took the paper anyway. Now, as she smoothed the page with trembling fingers, she began in the only way she knew how. "Dear Mother." The characters came slowly, delicately, as if afraid to touch the page too hard. What followed was not a report of military hardship, not a record of shame or defeat. It was something else entirely. "I am alive, I am well. They give us warm bread and clean water. There is music here, there is laughter. Today I drank something called soda and watched a man in a hat fall off a horse." She paused. It sounded like madness or betrayal. How could she explain this to her mother, a woman raised on the same wartime code of obedience and sacrifice? Masako had expected to die in service to the emperor. Instead, she was alive, sheltered, and slowly coming back to herself in the middle of Texas. She kept writing, "We are not beaten here. We are seen. They call us by name. They give us soap. They ask nothing in return but honesty. I do not know what to believe, but I know this. I am no longer afraid every time I wake." By the time she folded the letter, tears had stained the bottom of the page. She handed it to the same guard who had given her the paper. He looked at it, nodded, and tucked it into a canvas bag without reading it. For a brief moment, she felt something almost holy, like the letter itself had become a kind of proof. Not that the war was over, but that something inside her had survived it. Weeks later, thousands of miles away, a Japanese intelligence officer intercepted the letter. It was one of dozens flagged for examination, foreign correspondence from female auxiliary prisoners. Most were expected to contain nothing useful, but this one stunned him. He read it once, then twice, then passed it to his superior without a word. The superior frowned, reread the letter, and slammed it on the desk. "This is American propaganda," he muttered. "Lies meant to weaken morale." But the handwriting was unmistakable. The phrasing, the tenderness, it was not forged. It was simply impossible. In Tokyo, a mother received only silence. The letter was never delivered. But it existed, and within the camp, Masako didn't know if her words would ever cross the ocean. Yet something remarkable had changed. For the first time since capture, she had spoken. Not shouted, not pleaded, spoken, freely, fully. It wasn't only a letter, it was a reckoning. She began writing more, even if they weren't sent. Journals, small poems, letters folded and placed beneath her mattress. Other women followed suit. They wrote to sisters, to brothers, to versions of themselves they feared they had lost. Some wrote prayers, others wrote songs. Their words would not be broadcast. They would not make headlines. But inside that camp, their voices returned. And in a war built on silence, obedience, and erasure, the simple act of saying, "I am here," became the quietest form of rebellion, and perhaps the most powerful. If you're enjoying this story, let us know by liking the video and leaving a comment below. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. At night, the bunkhouse fell into hush. Outside, the cicadas sang their endless rhythm beneath the Texas moon, and inside, women lay on their cots, staring up at the wooden slats above. The air was thick with sleep, but for many it did not come easily. Masako lay curled beneath her blanket, an American military issue, olive green, coarse at first, but softened with wash and time. She had pulled it to her chin without thinking. Only after she felt its warmth did she realize the betrayal in the gesture. She remembered the oath. They all did. It had been drilled into them since training. Better to die than to be captured. Death was duty. Surrender was disgrace. They had practiced it, on paper, in words, in breathless drills, where instructors screamed that the enemy would show no mercy. If captured, they were to bite their tongues, leap from cliffs, swallow shards of glass. Anything but this warm, quiet safety in the enemy's hands. She shifted beneath the blanket. A part of her still expected a reprimand. A part of her still waited for the knife to fall. But nothing came. Only the rustle of another woman turning in her sleep, and the soft sigh of breath. She stared into the dark, the memory of bootsteps in the mud echoing behind her eyes, and she wondered, was the real war now the one inside her? In the beginning, they had feared the guards. Then they feared their own comfort. Softness, it turned out, was more dangerous than cruelty. Pain could be fought. Orders could be resisted. But kindness? Kindness disarmed you, made you lower your eyes, made you doubt the certainty of your suffering. It crept in through soap and coffee, through music and mirrors. It found you in the way a door was held open, in the way your name was spoken without disdain. And in the blanket, too. Each night, that warmth settled over their shoulders like a question. What if everything we were taught was wrong? The answer never came loudly. It came in quiet moments, like when one of the older women, Junko, stood in the corner of the barracks one morning and simply stared at her hands. Then, without a word, she walked out to the garden patch near the fence. No one followed. She crouched in the dirt for nearly an hour, turning over the soil with her fingers, sifting pebbles from the loam. Later, when Masako passed by on her way to laundry duty, she saw it. A flower had been planted. Just one. A small, stubborn bloom, already leaning toward the sun. It wasn't sanctioned, it wasn't asked for, but it wasn't punished either. That evening, Junko said nothing, but she walked differently, straighter, as if her act of planting had given her a new kind of spine, not built from duty, but from choice. The next day, another flower appeared, and the day after, a small cluster. To the guards, it was just gardening, but to the women who had been trained to equate beauty with weakness, it was a quiet revolution, a defiance not of their country, but of despair, refusal to rot, a refusal to disappear. Masako curled beneath her blanket again that night. She no longer flinched when it touched her skin. Instead, she let it cover her fully, this strange foreign gift. Outside, the moon rose higher. Inside, the war inside her heart raged on. But tonight, she allowed herself this treason, sleep without shame. When the orders finally came, the news fell over the camp like a dust storm, sudden, choking, impossible to ignore. Repatriation. A return to Japan, home. The word rippled through the barracks as if someone had shouted fire. Some women cried with relief, others froze in silent dread. Masako felt both emotions crash together in her chest, colliding so violently she couldn't breathe. Home. The word no longer meant what it once had. They boarded the trucks in the same heat that had greeted them months before, but everything felt different now. Their bodies were heavier, healthier. Their cheeks had color. Their hair was clean and combed. Some carried letters the guards had written for them, small tokens pressed into their palms. Luck, safe journey, take care. One cowboy pressed a jar of jam into Masako's hands, muttering, "It ain't much, but it's sweet." She tried to thank him, but the words lodged in her throat. At the docks, the ship stood waiting. And so did the truth. When they stepped ashore in Japan, weeks later, it felt like walking into the ghost of a memory. The air was heavy with soot. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, twisted metal, broken stone, and the silence of cities whose voices had been bombed into dust. Children stared at them with hollow eyes. Women scavenged among the rubble. Even the sea breeze, once familiar, smelled of ash. Masako felt her stomach lurch. She remembered the gardens in Texas, the bread, the blankets, the piano's trembling keys. Here, there was nothing soft, no warmth, no mercy. A government official met them at the port. He did not smile. "You have returned," he said, voice clipped. "Make no mention of your treatment. The enemy lies. Do not dishonor your families with tales of comfort. You were prisoners, nothing more." Prisoners. The word hit harder than any weapon. As they walked through the broken streets toward temporary lodging, people watched them, some with pity, others with disgust. One woman spat at the ground as they passed. Another whispered, "Cowards." The shame tasted like iron. But beneath the shame, another feeling simmered. Something stubborn, something glowing faintly, like an ember sheltered by cupped hands. Masako lay down that night on a thin mat in a shelter that smelled of mildew and smoke. Children cried in the next room. Rats skittered beneath the floorboards. She pulled the American blanket from her sack. She had folded it tightly, hidden it under clothing so no official would confiscate it, and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, familiar, dangerous. She closed her eyes and saw Texas, the vast sky, the music in the chapel, the soda fizzing over her fingers, the cowboy tipping his hat, the flower blooming stubbornly in the camp garden. She felt more human in captivity than she did here, in this freedom shaped by ruin. She hated herself for thinking it. She clung to the thought anyway. In the weeks that followed, she tried to slip back into the rhythm of her old life: obedience, humility, silence. But the seed had already been planted, a seed made of soap and salt, of music and kindness. It refused to die. She found herself washing her hands more gently, humming the hymn she'd heard in the chapel, tending a small patch of dirt behind the shelter where she planted a single flower, just as Junko had done. It wasn't much, but it was hers, a reminder that dignity was not given by nation or uniform. It was something human, fragile and stubborn, and once you had known it, truly known it, no war, no shame, no ruined homeland could take it away. If this story moved you, give it a like and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Or